All right, guys, welcome back for section 2 of chapter 7. Today we'll be looking at monopolies, how they're formed, what characteristics they have, how they set their output levels, so on and so forth. So monopolies are our next market structure. So some key terms here for you. A monopoly is just a market in which a single seller dominates the market. Economies of scale are factors that cause a producer's average cost per unit to actually fall as output rises. Lots of times that's due to high startup costs. We'll look at that in a minute. Natural monopolies are a market that runs most efficiently when one firm supplies all of the output. So monopolies are not always bad, and we'll talk about the ways in which they can be good. A government monopoly is a monopoly created by the government, usually through a patent process. So right now, the EpiPen, more or less a government monopoly, because they have the sole right to produce that good at the moment. So like I said, government monopolies are often created through a patent process. A patent is a license that gives the inventor of a new product the exclusive right to sell that product for a specific period of time. And the purpose of a patent is really to encourage innovation. A franchise is a contract that gives a single firm the right to sell its goods within an exclusive market. So when we think franchise, we probably think like fast food restaurants, right? And more or less that fits within this definition as well, because the person who owns the McDonald's on Veterans in West Fargo has the right to sell that product there within that market. A license is a government issued right to operate a business. Licenses can be issued by state governments, they can be issued federally. And then we'll talk about price discrimination, which is division of consumers into groups based on how much they will pay for a good. So if you think of like a senior citizens, like special price for those that are 65 and older, or kids menu prices, those are kind of a form of price discrimination. And then with monopolies come a lot of market power. So that's really the ability to control prices and total market output. So I said we would look at these same characteristics with each of our different market structures. So the first characteristic was number of firms, and we said with perfect competition that we would have many firms. In a monopoly, we only have one. We had no variety of goods in perfect competition, and that is also true for a monopoly. There's only one type of good because there's only one person to buy it from. With a monopoly, there are a lot of barriers to entry, high startup costs, high degree of technical knowledge required, which was not the case for perfect competition. And then in perfect competition, no single seller had control over prices. In a monopoly, a seller has complete control over the price of a good. So, some characteristics of monopolies, we just covered them. This asks for 3. So try and think about those to yourself. What is it? Right, we have a single seller in the market, many barriers to entry, a unique product, no close substitute, complete control over prices, right? All of those are characteristics. So different market conditions can create different types of economies. So some monopolies enjoy what's known as economies of scale. Basically, these are characteristics that cause the producer's average cost to drop as production rises. So lots of times in monopolies, we have a lot of startup costs involved. And so the first products they create is going to be super, super expensive when we're thinking about like marginal cost, how much it costs to create one item. But eventually, over time, if we're creating 10,000 items instead of one, we can divide out that startup cost over 10,000 items instead of divide it by one. And so our production cost per unit can actually fall as output increases in economies of scale. Most of the time in like perfect competition or some of the other market structures, you would eventually see an uptick in average total cost. Um, and that would happen when output exceeds a certain level. So we talked in the last chapter about how they should set their level of output where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, because that's going to be the most profitable amount for them. That's not really how they set output in monopolies, because monopolies have complete control. So when we were talking marginal cost equals marginal revenue, we were assuming perfect competition. So you won't need to know a ton on this, but you just need to know we got a lot of startup costs, so we got to divide that out over a lot of product, and that's going to bring our average total cost or our marginal cost down with each additional unit. So another type of monopoly is a natural monopoly. An example of a natural monopoly would be like public water or gas and utilities. Water, for example, if water were part of a perfectly competitive market, different companies would have to spend a ton of money to dig the reservoirs, to put in the water lines, and it would just be a really inefficient use of land and water and resources. And so with natural monopolies, it's actually more cost effective to have just one business. In our case, it's going to be the city of West Fargo that runs the show. Because it would just be so expensive for all of these different companies to dig those water lines, put them in, and it would just be a bad use of resources. Sometimes technology can destroy a natural monopoly. So a new innovation could cut costs enough that multiple small companies can become just as efficient as one firm. So we're seeing like introduction of more competition within the internet, the market for internet, right? Like originally it was just phone companies that provided internet because they were already running the phone lines, and so that was a natural monopoly more or less. But now we have Midco and Sparklight and CenturyLink, like they're all burying their cable all over town so that people actually have a choice when it comes to their internet provider. And that's due to technological advances, right? Because it's not very expensive for them to bury such small wire. And so then we can have more options as consumers. Now, sometimes government actions can lead to the creation of a monopoly, which is then what we call a government monopoly. So a few ways that they do this is by issuing a patent, so giving a company an exclusive right to sell a good. And they issue patents to really encourage innovation, because why would you put the work into developing a new product if you knew that someone else could just copy you and make the money from that product as well? Governments can also grant franchises. So just like McDonald's corporate can grant a franchise, the government can do the same sort of thing, giving a single firm the right to sell within an exclusive market. And governments also are going to issue licenses. So in North Dakota, if you want to start a business, there's relatively low startup costs involved in most business. You do need to get a business license though. And so That license allows you to operate your business. And licenses are especially important in industries where resources are scarce, or um, where the community wants to like limit the number of competitors in a market. So, for example, in Fargo and West Fargo, if you want to open a bar restaurant, you need to get a liquor license, and they only issue 3 new liquor licenses per year. Otherwise, you need to basically buy out another bar that already has one, because they purposefully want to limit the number of bars and restaurants, so that we have an appropriate number of options for our population. So a monopolist is really going to look at the big picture and try and maximize profits, just like any other business owner. But for a monopoly, lots of times this means they're going to produce fewer goods to keep prices high, right? So if supply is in short, I guess if a good is in short supply, a monopolist can keep prices high, as a result of that, because demand is outweighing supply. So just kind of going back to the like law of demand and all of that, how that interacts with monopolies. As a reminder, the law of demand states that buyers will demand more of a good at a lower price. But as a monopolist, they want to keep prices high, or they will receive less in profits, because generally speaking, demand for their goods can be inelastic because there's not a ton of available substitutes. There's a lot of startup costs involved for the monopolists, so they want to keep prices high. And so we kind of have to figure out this balance between consumers wanting low prices and monopolists wanting to make a profit. One of the key differences between monopolies and perfect competition is in that a perfectly competitive market, marginal revenue is always the same as the market price. So if you remember that from the 5.3 notes, or 5.2, I believe. And so each firm would receive the same market price, essentially, no matter how much it produces. And in a monopoly, this is just not the case. They're going to actually see falling marginal revenue. So this table kind of lays that out, but it says like when 8,000 doses are made, they can charge $12 per dose, but as production rises to 11,000 doses, the price falls to $9 because there's more supply. So that's where pricing can get tricky with a monopoly. So this looks like a mess, right? You won't need to know a ton of this graph, but this is how they set price in a monopoly. So normally in perfect competition, what we talked about with our chapter on supply was that they would set output at the location where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So that would be point A. So we would expect that in a perfectly competitive market, this, I'm assuming medication because they're saying doses, this medication would cost $3 per dose. But with a monopoly, we have more demand than supply because there's not many suppliers, there's only one, right? So the demand curve is way up here. So what we're going to do in a monopoly is we're actually going to set our price where we're going to do the output level at point A, but we're going to set our price where that output level meets demand. So in a monopoly, they could get away with charging $11 per dose versus $3. So you won't need to know a ton about that, but you kind of got to know that because we have short supply in a monopoly, demand outweighs it, and that allows a monopolist to increase their price. So they're going to set their price at point B on this graph. Now, in many cases, a monopolist will charge the same price to all customers, but in some instances, a monopolist may be able to charge different prices to different groups. And this is known as price discrimination. So price discrimination is based on the idea that each customer has a maximum price that they'll be willing to pay for a good. So you may have experienced price discrimination at the movie theater, or if you've gone bowling, you'll see like kids prices, adult prices, student prices, senior citizen prices, right? And everyone's getting the same good, but they're paying a different price for that good. So most of the time, price discrimination takes effect through targeted discounts. So discounted fares, discounted rates, student discounts, senior citizen discounts, children eat free promotions, right? So in order for price discrimination to work, there has to be a few different conditions in place in a market for this to fly. So first, firms have to have some market power. So we'll just think about the movie theater example, right? Marcus Theaters has a lot of market power in the Fargo area. The two biggest theaters are owned by them, right? So they have some market power. They don't have a ton of real competition. Customers have to be divided into distinct groups. So most of the time we do see price discrimination based on age. You're not going to see price discrimination based on gender or race or anything else like that. That's really like a protected class federally. But most of the time we see it based on age. With price discrimination, buyers cannot be in a position where they can easily resell the good. Because if they can resell the good, what's keeping me from sending my child in to buy a movie ticket for me so they can get it at that price and then come out and give it to me, and then I go in and now as an adult I got in for the price of a child? That doesn't really work that way, right? So buyers can't be in a position where they can easily resell their good. When you're going to the movies, you go in, you say, we have one kid, one student, two adults, right? And then you get your movie tickets and you go and watch your movie. You don't go resell them in the parking lot. So that's a really important factor with price discrimination. All right, this is one of our lengthier sections. Please let me know if you have questions. And we'll be moving on to the next couple types of market structures in the coming days. Have a good rest of your day.